Now the first thing we're going to do is a long tail cast on. So you're going to need about 2 yards because we're going to cast on 60 stitches. So measure out for yourself from your yarn about 2 yards. Then we're going to start with a slip knot. Once you have your slip knot, you're going to put that onto your needle. Now we're going to proceed to do the long tail cast on. So if you've watched any of my other knitting videos, you know I have this little Tweety bird. He sticks his nose where it doesn't belong. He gets scared, grabs onto the first thing he sees, and what scared him was a gun. So there's my gun. And I'm going to go up, down, and into that hole right there, and I'm going to pull through. I'm going to do that till I have 60 stitches. So there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and you're just going to keep doing this till you get to 60. $51, $52, $53, $54, $55, $56, $57, $58, $59, $60. All right, so we now have our 60 stitches on our needle. You're going to turn your needle so that all of your stitches are to the left, and we are going to get ready to knit the first row of seed stitch. Now seed stitch is done as a knit 1, purl 1 on your odd rows and a purl 1, knit 1 on your even rows. So this is row 1, this is an odd row. So we're going to begin with a knit stitch. Then we're going to move our yarn between our needles into the front and do a purl stitch. Now I'm going to move my yarn between my needles to the back, and I'm going to do a knit stitch. And I am just going to knit 1, purl 1 all the way across this row. Moving my yarn back between my needles, I will knit 1. Moving my yarn between my needles to the front, then I can purl 1. Back, knit, forward, purl. Now it's really important that I'm always moving my yarn between my needles like this and not over my needle like this. If I move my yarn over my needle and then purl, I will have added an extra stitch. So we don't want to do that. If your stitch falls off, you can always just put it right back on. So you're always going to be moving your yarn between your needles to purl and between your needles to knit. And you're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way across. Now, just some things to tell if you can't remember if the last stitch you did was a knit or a purl. What you're going to look at is what you're seeing up under the needle on your right hand needle. So you can see this first stitch on my needle has this little bump underneath it. This next one has what looks like 2 little bars making a V. Then you can see a bump, and then you can see a V. Here's a bump, here's a V. So if there's a V right under the needle, that stitch was knit. If there's a bump right under the needle, that stitch was purled. So you can see that my last stitch here was purled. There's the purl. The one before that was knit. So I need to knit the next stitch. I'm going to move my yarn between my needles, and I'm going to knit, and then I'm going to purl. Now, should you forget and accidentally you purled 2 in a row, that is easy to fix. You're just going to take your left hand needle, slide it under that purl bump, take your right needle out, and voila, you have undone it. Now I can move my yarn between my needles to the back, and I can knit, and I can purl, and I can knit, and I can purl. Now let's say I've accidentally knit 2 stitches in a row. I knit 1, and I forgot to move my yarn, so I knit 1 again. You can see here how I have 2 V's instead of a V and then a bump. You'll put your left hand needle into the V, take your right needle out, and that stitch is undone. You can now move your yarn between your needles to the front, and you can purl. So let's go ahead and finish that first row. Knit 1, purl 1, all the way across. All right, so I'm almost done with my first row of seed stitch. I'm going to knit, purl, knit, purl, whoops, purl, knit, purl. All right, that completes the first row of seed stitch. I'm going to turn my work. Get my tail out of the way here. It wants to be involved, but it's not going to have a chance. Now, on the second row, on the even rows, instead of knitting 1 and then purling 1, you're actually going to do the opposite. You're going to purl 1 and knit 1. If you look closely, you see my little V that shows that this is a knit stitch, and my little purl bump that shows that's a purl stitch. I'm going to be purling the knit stitches and knitting the purls. So I'm going to purl this knit stitch, knit this purl stitch, purl this knit stitch, knit this purl stitch, all the way across. So I begin with a purl, knit, purl, knit, and I'm going to be continuing to be careful to make sure that when I move my yarn from front to back for knitting and purling, that I'm always moving that yarn between my needles and never over the top of one of my needles. But you're just going to do it backwards, purl, knit, all the way till the end of the second row. Casting off, I'll go ahead and show you how to do that real quick in case you need a refresher. So casting off is very much like knitting. You're going to knit the first stitch, you are going to knit the second stitch, but instead of continuing, you're going to take that first stitch you knit and you are going to pass it over the second stitch and off the needle so that you have 1 again. Let me see if I can get that closer to the camera for you. So you are going to knit another stitch so that you have 2 on your right hand needle. And then you're going to move this one over and off. Knit another stitch, move it over and off. Knit another stitch, move it over and off. And you are going to continue like this until you have only 1 stitch remaining. Then you'll just pull your yarn through, your yarn tail. Now you want to leave at least a 6-inch tail coming off when you're done so that you can weave in your ends later. When we finish this blanket, we're going to be seaming them up in some way. I don't actually know how that's going to work, but it'll be fun to see. But you can see that very nice bind off edge that's being created. You don't want to bind off too tightly, so keep your tension nice and loose, but you'll just continue in that till you've bound off all of your stitches.